Good morning, everyone. I'm Suven Bhattacharjee from Kolkata, and I thank the Kerala Society of Ophthalmic Surgeons and Dr. Sai Kumar for this kind invitation to speak on and give a keynote lecture on hooks and rings in small pupil. I do have a financial interest in the BX Pupil Expander, and I gratefully acknowledge the contribution of Dr. Netra Rosatelli, Dr. Deepak Megor, and Dr. Ajay Paul in lending their videos. So why do we need hooks and rings in small pupil? Because of the first principle of medicine is do no harm. So if you ask yourself, if you have a cataract and a non-dilating 4 mm pupil and a very skilled surgeon is operating, what would you prefer? The surgeon use only skill and no device, or the surgeon use both pupil device and skill? Since availability and cost both are not an issue, it's better to be safe than sorry. This paper in 2011 by Alessandra Casaccio and co-workers concluded that for a 7 mm or smaller pupil, the risk of IFIS existed regardless of alpha-adrenergic receptor antagonist treatment. And that is the long list of predisposing conditions that may cause IFIS. So you have antihypertensive drugs, hypertension, apart from, and diabetes mellitus, apart from alpha blockers. So no amount of history taking can prevent surprises. And intraoperative myosis is unpredictable. And that's a study from India by Shilpa Goel and co-workers. And that showed us that prevalence of tamsulosin intake and IFIS incidence was much higher in India. And current tamsulosin or alfuzosin use and hypertension are very important risk factors. So we need a very disciplined approach to use iris hooks and pupil expanders in small pupil. We must consider every eye is a potential IFIS candidate and reduce our threshold for using a pupil device and keep ourselves well stocked. We must learn where and how much of viscoelastic needs to be injected. And it's very important to distinguish the elastic from the non-elastic rigid pupil. The choice of the pupil expander will depend on the pupil device will depend on elasticity of the pupil and how you wish to tear a rigid pupil. We need to learn about the desired size of an expanded pupil with a device and how does IFIS behave or the pupil devices behave in IFIS. And then we'll come to a few specific tips about iris hooks and pupil expanders. So when we inject viscoelastic, initially we always have a tendency to inflate the anterior chamber, and that leaves no space because for the pupil device, because the iris gets plastered to the anterior lens capsule. So it's best to inject a little viscoelastic under the pupil margin. That lifts off the pupil margin from the lens capsule and we keep the anterior chamber underfilled with viscoelastic. Iris bowing helps in hooking the iris and tucking the flanges. So overfilling will push the iris against the lens capsule. And so if you inject viscoelastic under the pupil margin, you're creating space for the device. David Chang and John Campbell in 2005 told us that unlike the non-elastic myotic pupil, the IFIS pupil immediately snaps back to its original size following attempts to stretch it. So the small pupil is of two types, elastic and non-elastic rigid type. The elastic is very much like a rubber band and it's stretchable, so any device will work. Whereas the non-elastic is like a string and it's not stretchable, it can be torn. So you require a strong and bulky expander or Kuglen hooks to tear it. So we need to check the elasticity or rigidity of the pupil before we start. So as soon as we've done the paracentesis, inject a bit of BSS and you'll see that elastic pupil expand momentarily, and that is a sign that you do not need to stretch this pupil. Whereas the same thing when you do in a rigid pupil, there is no expansion or a minimal expansion. That suggests that the pupil is rigid and you need to stretch it with two Kuglen hooks or with any other device so that you kind of make it a little elastic so that you can use the devices. So mechanical dilatation of pupil in IFIS, it's an elastic pupil. Pupil stretching is not effective. Whereas when it's a rigid or fibrotic pupil, a controlled stretching before using the pupil expander is effective. So we have the iris hooks, which we have used for a very long time. And then we have the likes of Mulligan ring, the BX pupil expander, the I ring, or the APX pupil expander. The choice of the pupil expander depends on how you wish to tear the rigid pupil or the non-elastic pupil. If you're okay doing it with two Kuglen hooks, you'll have controlled tears. You can use the hair-thin BX, which occupies very little space and it allows you easy movement of instruments. If you'd like to do it with the pupil expander, you'll have poor control and asymmetric tears. You could use the Mulligan ring, the APX, or the I ring. It's a bulky device and they will come in the way of your devices. Let's see this very small pupil. Once the fibrotic ring is removed, it is elastic. So you see that 1 millimeter pupil is still elastic enough to allow us use of a BHEX. You could use any device, but what I'm trying to emphasize is the elasticity of the pupil, which is important, and not the size. Though you require a bimanual procedure over here, but it's the pupil, that 1 millimeter pupil is so elastic that it allows you tucking of the flanges quite comfortably. And that allows you a 5.5 pupil, which allows you all steps of phaco very comfortably. So what matters most is the elasticity of the pupil and not the size of the pupil. Remember that. In IFIS, the devices can behave differently. So let's see how they work. If we take the meiosis and the iris prolapse components, now the iris hooks or pupil expander both provide a constant pupil size, which allows good visibility and safe phacoemulsification. For iris prolapse, no device works. Actually, iris prolapse depends on IFIS severity, the pathological damage to iris stroma and muscles. So there is no credit to the pupil devices when you don't have iris prolapse. It's just lower grade IFIS. So a favorable tube device would be one which requires small incisions, has a thin or low vertical profile, can exit through the side port. Iris hooks and BHEX both are very well suited for this. So let's talk about iris hooks. I'd like to make the side ports first and then the hooks. Don't overfill as I suggested. The paracentesis has to be clear corneal, posterior directed, and 0.5 millimeter. You must always leave a conjunctival mark, and that helps you identify it. So there I'm leaving that conjunctival mark once I've made that paracentesis. That helps it identify the paracentesis once you're coming back to them. So once you use that, retract that stopper far enough, hold the iris hook sideways, do not pull the hook all the way. And you can advance that stopper as you withdraw. This is an over-retracted pupil. This was very early days. So phaco incision is done only after the hooks are placed. Do not get carried away while making the capsulorhexis. You should make it to a controlled size. Remember that the pupil margin is limited to the limbal plane and it's often anti-flex. So when you're negotiating instruments to the side port, be careful and mindful that you do not engage the pupil margin or the iris. While removing, you just hold the stopper, advance the hook, and hold the hook distal to the stopper, pull with the hook sideways, and the device just comes out. Look at that once again. Hold that stopper, advance the hook, turn it sideways, and just pull it, and momentarily straightens, and it comes out. That's a rhomboid pupil proposed by Oting and Omfra. I'm sorry, it's a very old video. I don't use too much of iris hooks these days. A few pearls, that's a rigid pupil and over retraction on one side, no stretch done initially. That's a very wrong thing. And usually see how I tear that pupil sphincter and it's a mess. It's a very bad cosmetic pupil that I have there. Once I pull that retractor, that pupil is torn. So how do you avoid the capsulorhexis? Just put a second instrument and tent up that pupil margin and then hook. It can give you absolutely clear of the capsulorhexis, and then you can adjust that stopper to give you good retraction. There are a couple of disadvantages, a little risk of iris infection because of multiple insertion, and there's a tendency for over retraction, as I said. There is a lot of wasted space in the corners with iris hooks. That's why rings probably work much better, and you could have bad disfigured pupils and marks on the iris because of hooks. So we came out with the BHEX. BHEX has flanges and notches. The notches are thin and flexible, and we have tabs for holding. We require only the BHEX 23 gauge forceps is recommended nowadays. So that's the BHEX 23 gauge forceps. Look for the genuine BHEX mark. It's a short curved stalk with serrated jaws. The jaws open perpendicular to the plane of squeeze handle, and it's ergonomically very convenient to use with the BHEX pupil expander. Those are the 5 steps for using the BHEX by Dr. Deepak Meghoor. OVD under the iris, just to lift up the pupil margin, and the BHEX over the iris. You place it in the antechamber, and then you tuck alternate flanges under the pupil margin. That's the first flange which has gone under the pupil margin, and that's the second alternate flange which goes under the pupil margin. And as you move to the third flange, you have a wonderful hexagonal pupil. Once the third flange is tucked, you have a hexagonal pupil which allows you good visibility. So how big do you want the pupil to be? Aren't we all skilled to perform phaco through a 5.5 pupil which will not get smaller? So BHEX gives you a short 5.5 pupil, and do not make the pupil larger than 5.5 with iris hooks too. Look at this. This is a rigid pupil, pseudoexfoliation, hard cataract, and look at Dr. Deepak Meghoor doing the surgery with a BHEX, which provides a 5.5 pupil, which is adequate for even the hardest of cataracts. You can do a vertical chop the nucleus into small fragments so that you don't have any difficulty taking them out, and see the placement of the lens. And it's so easy. And once you remove the pupil expander, the pupil is round. So the essential difference or the inventive step is that the BHEX is in a single plane and the iris bends at the notches. And as you know, the iris can be bent harmlessly. And the BHEX can be removed through a 1 mm side port, which no pupil device can do. You just need to disengage and draw it out of the side port incision. And in intraoperative miosis, the BHEX is very useful, you see, because you just need to inject little viscoelastic and lift up that pupil margin, and you can place those flanges under the pupil margin and over the capsulorhexis rim under direct visualization. And as you do that, you have instant confirmation that you have not engaged the capsulorhexis margin. And once you've done that, you're back to your comfort zone. So the choice of the pupil expander depends in intraoperative miosis would be the one which can safely engage the pupil margin without catching the capsulorhexis. And I think the iris hooks and BHEX both are very well suited for this. Now, this is a femtosecond laser assisted cataract surgery where the pupil became 4.1 millimeters while the femto procedure was being done. The surgeon, Dr. Ajay Paul, went ahead and did the flax and the nuclear fragmentation. But when it came to the phaco, he felt that he needed a pupil expander to allow safe pupil expansion, so visibility to do safe phaco surgery. And there is the BHEX. You can see after the capsulorhexis, in a femtocapsulorhexis, it so safely allows you a pupil expansion so that you can complete your phaco uneventfully. The choice of pupil expander in a subluxated cataract, according to me, is always iris hooks. Iris hooks can asymmetrically expand the pupil in clock hours of interest, and you can change the clock hour of interest in subluxation, which can be a big problem once in a while. I'd encourage you to look up this article on phacoemulsification in small people, the 10 tips, my 10 tips. It's available at eophtha.com. Thank you very much for this kind invitation and your attention.